Welcome to Sci-Fi-prenuership, an Old Turtles podcast series that takes a look at how science fiction inspires people to envision the future and then create it.
Whew, it's a little less dystopian now.
Only slightly less. This is kind of sort of a mixed work, I think. We're talking about Snow Crash, a novel by Neal Stephenson.
Snow Crash is set in the real world and the Metaverse, meaning a shared virtual reality space, and follows the character named Hero Protagonist, who receives a data file called Snow Crash, which causes computers to crash, but also results in brain damage for people in the physical world, or real world, which is the real world now.
The meat world.
Meat world.
Meat world. There's the meta world and the meat world. Rearranging the letters a little bit.
Yeah, just changing it slightly.
Oh, why didn't we see that before?
We saw it now. That's what matters.
That's what's important. But, and this was written again in 92. It predicted a bunch of stuff, but like we talked about in the intro to the whole series, it actually described a bunch of things which then people like us actually copied and built into the real world. But there's a quote where it basically describes exactly Google Earth. But it also maybe predicted things that we didn't know about until just like a year ago or so, which was this corrosive physical effect that being online, social media, device overexposure can have. It's actually kind of startling that even a book that's Snow Crash, you continue to find things in it years and years and decades after.
Yeah. In similar light with Google Earth, there's Second Life, which is an online virtual world with no set objective, which is somewhat similar to the Metaverse, albeit significantly less advanced, but an online world, the meta world versus the meat world, where people who have meat forms really go far with it.
Can interact and can be what they think they want to be. This was Second Life was a really early attempt at this, although it wasn't the first. It was maybe the first like fully realized 3D world.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was in college, there was MUDs, multi-user dungeons, and there's a lot of text-based stuff like this. And as always, we have a fascinating series of high-achieving guests to talk about how Snow Crash influenced their life. We've got, for the first time in the show, Veronica Belmont, a well-known internet person, currently product manager at Adobe and the co-founder of the very popular Sword and Laser. Dr. Christine Corbett Moran. Dr. Moran, been on the series before. She's a cybersecurity engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, which is so cool.
Peter Eckersley, who's also been on before, is the director of research at the Partnership on AI.
Joe Betts-LaCroix is new to the series. He's the inventor of the world's smallest computer. Teeny tiny, at least back then it was, and his work in biophysics aims to optimize medical research priorities in the U.S.
But up first, we have Sophia Bruckner. She is an artist and computer scientist and also a professor at the University of Michigan.
My name is Sophia Bruckner. I am a professor at the Stamp School of Art and Design and the School of Information at the University of Michigan. Before this, I went to the MIT Media Lab. I studied art and design at the Rhode Island School of Design. And before that, I was a software engineer at Google. And I have a background in computer science and applied math. Primarily here at the school, I teach things that are heavily related to technology. I teach programming, digital fabrication, design, art and technology, and the thing I'm most known for is teaching a class called Sci-Fi Prototyping, which I've been teaching since 2011, which is a class that combines the reading of science fiction, watching films, experiencing science fiction in other forms, as an inspiration for students to build prototypes, which is intended to inspire people to think outside the box, but also to think extrapolatively about the ethical implications of what happens when technologies scale up.
Could you talk about overall for you specifically how science fiction has been an inspiration?
Well, I have been reading science fiction since I was a little kid. When I was in graduate school for art and technology, there were all kinds of people around me who were doing projects about, augmented reality, different ways that humans could interface with computers. And every time someone had a project, I would say like, oh, there's a science fiction story about this. And that happens so often, people ask me to teach a class about it. So that's where actually my class started.
So now we will delve into Snow Crash. Do you remember how old you were when you first read it and what was something that stuck with you?
I think the first time I read Snow Crash was when I was in college. And one of the things that really stuck with me about it was the fact that based on how much money you had different levels of resolution. So like someone who had not very much money would be rendered in the virtual world with black and white, very low resolution avatars, and that the people who had more were able to actually represent themselves more expressively. And I think that was one of the things that stood out to me the most. In my sci-fi class, I've been recently assigning Diamond Age most often, but just this semester I assigned Snow Crash, so I just discussed this book with my students too.
What was their reaction to that story?
One of the things that's not related to identity that really stood out with me in the book with my students was my students are younger now, so they actually had no idea what GeoCities was. And I was trying to explain to them that the book, the way that people are traversing the world in Snow Crash is very similar to the way GeoCities mapped out the internet in like early days of the internet. And my students had no idea what GeoCities was. So we actually went into the Wayback Machine and we looked at GeoCities, and they were both amazed and charmed by the fact that people actually were using the internet in a way that didn't involve search and that was actually organized according to neighborhoods.
That's really interesting, because I do wonder what it would be like to read that book for the first time now.
Well, to me, that doesn't seem like the idea of neighborhoods and like organizing the internet according to neighborhoods makes total sense, because I lived during GeoCities, but my students, they were mystified.
We, as the tech industry, and myself included, had spent a lot of time reading things like Snow Crash and then duplicating or trying to build some of the actual technologies contained in it, like really focusing on the technology. So like Google Earth was specifically designed, after reading Snow Crash. The first virtual products were inspired by Snow Crash. There's lots of things like that. And what we didn't do is spend a lot of time thinking about the world, the society that these books depicted. We thought about the technology that was in them, but not the society that was created. And maybe
would you want to live in the world of Snow Crash?
Exactly.
No, exactly.
Right.
Like all of Neal Stephenson's book, there's none I want to live in.
It's
Right.
quite dystopian.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want it. While Neal Stephenson is very inspiring for coming up with interesting gadgets and interesting technologies, I would not want to live in any of his worlds.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's broadly true of a lot of sci-fi, where we can say, well, I kind of want this gadget, and then not think about, well, what is the role of this gadget or these gadgets in making the world depicted? And that world is usually not a pleasant world. I mean, with exceptions of maybe
Star Trek.
Yeah, Star Trek is maybe one of the only ones that we can point to. That's a world that we would rather live in.
But it is really a lot easier to be dystopian than it is to be utopian.
Yeah, because it doesn't take as much imagination. Like you can kind of see how things will go wrong. It doesn't take an act of creative imagination to see how things can go right.
Well, I kind of see two extremes, both in my students and just when I'm going around talking to people. I see people either who are very cynical and really immediately go towards the dystopian view, or I see people who tend to be towards engineers who tend to lean towards this techno-solutionistic view, where they think they see a problem in the world and they could come up with some sort of technology that will solve it. But they look at it through a narrow lens, which prevents them from seeing all the repercussions it could have as well. Kind of a anecdote is that I've noticed more and more in the last couple of years since I've been teaching my class is that students really struggle to be positive about technology. We've been watching Black Mirror episodes.
That's changed? Like, do you
yes,
think
I do. Black Mirror only is kind of a recent development.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've been watching Black Mirror in class. And I've had students who we've watched, I don't know if you remember the episode Nosedive. That's this extremely dystopian episode about the future of social networking and star ratings.
Oh, is that the pastel episode?
It's very pastel.
Yeah, I just remember everything was pastel colors. Yeah, that's actually the last episode I watched. I can't anymore. Black Mirror, I can't.
It's really dark, but I actually showed that to my students recently, and it was amazing to me that my students, who are undergraduates for the most part, told me they couldn't see any way around that. Like, they just thought it was inevitable. And I've never had that happen to me before. I mean, I've been teaching this class since 2011, and I've never had students who are that cynical before. And I've sort of noticed that cynicism increasing. And to me, like, it's really alarming that I have students who are going to be going out into the world and designing and inventing new technologies. If they feel like a Black Mirror episode is inevitable and they are the ones who are going to be designing the technologies that we're all going to consume in the future, it is so alarming to me that they think such a dystopian, horrible future is inevitable. And I really don't want them to go out into the world with that attitude.
Right.
Why do you think that they feel that it's inevitable? It's like, I mean, you could just not build that stuff. And
I don't know, recently with tech companies, I think there's a palpable sense of powerlessness. People really don't feel like they have control over, I think, their experience of how they use these technologies. I don't know if they feel like they can really opt out if they wanted to opt out, or if they could tune their experience to something they felt more comfortable with. I think that might change when you just look at the news and how much is in the news this year. The awareness of the implications of a lot of the technologies that have a lot of control over our life, I think while it's very scary, I think it is a good thing that it's become more aware by people in the mainstream, and maybe will lead to individual people feeling like they have more control.
But I think the helplessness is a very unattractive trait in this. I think these students have far more agency than anyone who's ever existed on this planet have had. And for them to be kind of cynical and helpless about it is just frankly bullshit and just being lazy.
Is it though? Because I would opt out of Facebook and all these technologies if I could, but I don't feel like I can for my job. I would absolutely choose an alternative or not do it at all, but I can't.
Well, I mean, but, the Black Mirror episode doesn't have to come anywhere remotely true. You could just build these systems the way that we want to build them. Someone is making these choices.
I used to be one of those people making those choices, and I don't know if it's as easy as you're describing it. Because I used to work on early social media. I worked at Google when we were responding to Facebook. I was there for all of those decisions. There were a lot of us who wanted to do things differently, but what happened was making a product that was super similar to Facebook.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't say it was easy. I think it's a life's work to make meaningful and virtuous things that move the world the way that it's supposed to be, moving to. And so identifying things like some of the aspects of Snow Crash, of Black Mirror, looking at the world that we don't want to live in and then actively saying, yeah, let's not do that. Let's do something specifically different. That's what agency means.
I do think Snow Crash is actually kind of inspiring because the virtual world that they created was so deliberate. And I don't feel like the social networks we exist in now were nearly as deliberate as the worlds that were created by Neal Stephenson, as dystopian as they are. And I think if you actually could construct a world with the same level of thoughtfulness, it could be better.
I agree. I think I mostly read Snow Crash as a positive book, even though the world it depicts is kind of crappy. And that is an interesting dichotomy, how I am a fan of a lot of the technologies depicted, and some of them have since come to fruition, and yet it's kind of easy to ignore the world that those technologies made.
Well, one of the things that's Hero and his peers, when they were designing this virtual world they were living in, they weren't thinking about ads. They weren't trying to optimize for ads. So I think that allowed them to design things differently. And I think that's right now trying to harvest people's attention really takes you down a certain design trajectory that it takes you away from many other possibilities that I think could be more positive.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this significantly about the social network I would want to build. Distributed, no ads, and you own your own data. But who funds that company? Is it a nonprofit? What does the org structure look like for something like that?
Well, we recently interviewed Catherine Marr, the executive director of Wikimedia.
So they're who I think of as a model.
Yeah, and they're, Wikipedia is a great example of something that is entirely open, has full API programmatic access to everything, and you would think would be just a cesspool of, manipulation and trolls and bots and everything else. And it just isn't. They've just designed a system that is still trustworthy, that's still pretty clean. That's, I think, the most trusted brand on the internet. Yeah. And what Catherine says about this is one of the reasons is that they're not trying to optimize for anything. They don't have
exactly. There's no incentive structure.
There is no min-max of any particular thing. They're trying to maximize their mission, and their mission is to make everyone better informed, but that's a relatively difficult to quantify mission. And so they give themselves the judgment to say, is this getting closer to our mission or further? And they don't care about things like, for example, time on site. Wikipedia doesn't care how many minutes you spend on a page.
And how many clicks you make.
I think that is really nice. I mentioned I worked at Google, so I was very familiar with all design decisions being driven by A/B testing, where it was if someone clicked on the link, that was the better design. If someone spent more time on something, that was the better design. And I think that takes you down a very narrow path that leaves a lot of opportunities unexplored. There are technologies that aren't cesspools. I think about Flickr wasn't a cesspool, and it was because of design. I believe the same designers did Medium, right? They've created a positive community, and I think it's because of design. I think it's because they've been more deliberate about their choices about how they're structuring social interactions.
Yeah. And even Instagram isn't, I mean, it's starting to develop its own set of problems, but it feels not quite as bad as other things. But like YouTube has taken a gigantic nosedive.
Yeah. Yes, it has.
But I think to your point in Snow Crash, like when Hero and his friends were making the design decisions they made, they weren't like, they were trying to do this out of a sense of craftsmanship. Like they were trying to make a world that they want to inhabit.
That they want to inhabit.
They want to inhabit.
Not
I totally
to maximize
agree with
profit.
that.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that that Snow Crash is dystopian, I feel like that there was that craftsmanship there, and they were being very deliberate about creating a world they wanted to inhabit. I totally agree with that.
And this was very directly inspirational to us when we were making Evernote. We very much and explicitly referencing Snow Crash. We were making the world that we wanted to inhabit. We were making the product that we wanted in our brain.
That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But then it gets perverted when you're only answering to profits.
I'm not convinced that Facebook ever had that shift, but I definitely remember when I worked for Google when that shift happened. We were thinking about social features before we felt all those pressures that came from Facebook, and I felt our design process really shifted once Facebook became a competitor. It became a lot less about the world that we wanted to make.
And what your students should do is to make stuff that they want to live in and not complain about how it can't be done.
That was maybe one semester of students.
No, I strongly encourage that. I give students a very hard time if they're making purely dystopian work.
Right.
I give them a very hard time if they're making blindly optimistic techno-solutionist work. The attitude I try to foster in my students is more, rather than black and white thinking, I say like medium to light gray thinking is good. So be earnest, be optimistic, but also be able to critique your own work and look at its weaknesses. For some reason, it's very hard for people to have that attitude, but that's the number one thing I try to teach in my courses. And I hope by the end of the semester, they're not believing that Black Mirror is inevitable.
Thanks so much to Sophia for all her insights. And we're joined by Veronica Belmont, a project manager at Adobe and the co-founder of Sword and Laser.
Snow Crash was the second book that we picked for Sword and Laser. And so we go back and forth between science fiction and fantasy books. And in that rereading, I was just so stunned. I mean, this is a book that came out in 1992, I think. And yeah, the internet was around-ish. But the things that Neal Stephenson really pointed to hadn't really come together yet in so many ways. I mean, the metaverse, for example, in Snow Crash, it's really this physical and virtual space that is still, I think, where we want the internet to be. And it's still working towards that in so many ways and has maybe informed some of those decisions. I mean, if you look at things like Second Life, for example, that's the closest thing I think I've come personally to a metaverse-like experience. Virtual spaces where people can come together and live part of their lives. This like amalgamation of augmented reality and virtual reality and data. It was way ahead of its time, I think. And that's the thing that most people talk about when they, or mention rather, when they talk about Snow Crash. It was, way ahead of its time. And I think Stephenson has continued to be one of those people that looks so far ahead of what's possible.
Well, and this is like the central hypothesis of what we're trying to kind of get at this podcast is like, was it ahead of its time or did it make its time? Like, because there's definitely examples, there's you talk to the guys who made Google Earth, they're like, yeah, we read that and we're like, let's make exactly that. Like we can make that.
But the idea of being able to like plug into a virtual space or, wearing peripherals that enable you to be part of that, they're definitely plugging in more hardcore than I think we do in certain ways. I mean, physically, and very low likelihood of you being able to be infected by a virus on the internet or the metaverse in this day and age.
Well, but that's an interesting question, though, because you could argue that there is types of like social infection. So it might not be the same type of virus.
Yeah.
But like if you look at some of the things that Facebook's going through, right? Like is that infecting people?
Brittney, that's dark. You're right. Oh my God. Because you're right.
Way to depress everyone.
Because in Snow Crash, it's language. I mean, the key is that you can be infected by language. And yes, you can be infected by the bitmap images and things associated with that. But really, at the end of the day, it's the virus is language. And so in our modern era, a virus is definitely language. It's definitely words and thoughts. And it infects all of us in one way or another. And even if you don't perceive it, you're being impacted by it. And oh, damn, I didn't think I needed to know that or think about that. But here we are.
Yeah, I mean, because if you look at it
bringing
too,
the truth.
even like from like the Reverend Wayne's Pearly Gates group, right? It's this religious group with some media magnate, eerily similar, really trying to infect both the hackers and then the regular people. Of course, the regular people getting blood transfusions or something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But it's really interesting because you can see how, like, even just the news media in general, not necessarily Facebook, but like how information is presented to you and what you tend to consume and how that shapes your worldview.
Right.
Not to say that Neal Stephenson predicted this, but it's just somewhat similar that language really does have a way.
His view was that, languages are codes. And is language code? Can we be coded by language? Are we? Yeah, there's some thought spirals you can get into that are pretty interesting.
Thanks to Veronica for joining us. We now turn to Peter Eckersley, who is the Director of Research at the Partnership on AI. Peter, some observations on the perhaps negative influence snow crashes had on today's hackers. Here's Peter.
I have a certain weakly negative connotation with the influences of maybe not all of Neal Stephenson's work, but Cryptonomicon and to a lesser extent Snow Crash, because I feel like they were foundational documents for my generation of hackers. So many people read these things and were clearly inspired by and shaped by them. And they have become, as a result, in some ways, plans for the things that technologists have been building. And the problem with that is, like, I look at people and I'm like, wait, don't you see that this was like a dystopian future? You're not supposed to go and build like the cryptocurrencies and the like anarchist floating islands. Like this isn't like a sign that the world is working well, right? It's a sign that like we've done something wrong. And yet my generation of technologists were full of people who took these narratives too literally. So the question that all of this leads to is there something about Neal Stephenson's writing that is particularly good at causing lots of technologists to run around and try and build every little thing, whether or not it's a good idea?
Yeah, I think that's a good question.
We've talked a bit about the snow crash implications for people, but what about the snow crash implications for AI and things that you work on? And what does that mean for us?
We are struggling with a pure computer science, pure technology pile of these, snow crash virus problems. Today, if you use a neural network to try to recognize something, there are inputs that totally fool it. Picture of a turtle that the AI thinks is a rifle. Or, of course, with software, there are inputs that cause that software to crash and let an attacker get control of the system. And so I think it does remain an open question whether we will find things like this more profoundly in the human brain, or more optimistically, whether the resistance we see to some degree in the human brain against this kind of adversarial input, people would call it, gives us hope that we might eventually be able to get our AI systems to have the same robustness at the low level.
The robustness of our AI systems is one of many connections we can draw between snow crash and the current and future reality of the technologies in our world. To keep snow crash discussion moving, we now bring in Dr. Christine Corbett Moran, cybersecurity engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab.
So Snow Crash was post the time when I was reading like classics, the point where my MIT colleagues were like, you have to read this or that. And it was probably one of the first 10 hardcore science fiction books I read on that list. And I remember being blown away by how exciting and weird and invigorating and depressing and bizarre the whole world was. And as well, just the storytelling that went behind it. Snow Crash struck a nice balance where I'm like, oh, this is a fun, bizarre, exciting, depressing, weird intro to this whole field. And so sometimes I give Snow Crash as a book to people who haven't read much sci-fi, like, here, try this out and see if it fits.
How has Snow Crash influenced or been a part of your life and your work?
Well, I once gave a talk on the visualization of large data sets on supercomputers in a community on Second Life platform that's very much inspired by Snow Crash's Metaverse. And, I had an avatar with purple hair and, in the audience, there was someone in a bunny suit and a bouncy ball. And it was simultaneously much more bizarre than your typical remote presentation. I had my slides behind me. I had a laser pointer even in the Metaverse that I could use, but also also much more intimate in that you could really see the physical interactions of people, raising their hands, walking around, how many people were in the audience, whether someone had left, all the things that you get a feel for in a talk in the actual universe here approximated in the metaverse.
The idea in Snow Crash, and one of the things that I found the most pervasive and that I have made an analogy to real world today, is that the whole virus that's infecting hackers is really language and code. And it's by seeing this code that you get infected. And a lot of what I was thinking about and these types of ways of interacting with the internet and with data and how it's actually rewriting us in a way and how it's like a virus. And I was wondering if that's something that and especially since you work in cybersecurity, this is an interesting analogy to you.
I mean, it's definitely amazing how much language and linguistics is a theme throughout a lot of science fiction from 1984. The power of language in influencing minds and programming minds, to Snow Crash, where it's taken to more of a literal level, where it's literally a virus in the way that a computer virus is. It's not necessarily language directly, but maybe modes of interaction with information and data currently that I think are rewriting our brains, whether it's attention span to the ways that information and the order in which information is presented to us in terms of autoplay on YouTube and recommendations and that stuff. It's all the same language. It's just the curation of the order of that can be used to change someone's behavior, change someone's mind. And I think it's very playful and very meta to take that to the extreme. And it's neat that Snow Crash has a lot of this real world, hard sci-fi feel to it. And this is one of the places that I think is more metaphor than actual reality, where it isn't going to be the case where we stare at a bit of computer code and our brains are reprogrammed. That's a metaphor for something. But it is the case that staring at our computers is reprogramming the way that we think about reality, the way we interact with our friends, and the way we interact with information in terms of, can I sit down and focus for 5 hours? It's a lot harder if there's a lot of distractions popping up, and a lot of that is driven by our modern platforms.
Thanks to Christine for highlighting some of the interesting ways that Snow Crash makes use of language. I really think this is one of the most timely topics with everything that's going on in the news right now. Now introducing our fourth and final guest for this episode, Jo Betts-LaCroix. Jo invented the world's smallest computer. It's really teeny tiny and works in biophysics today. Here's Jo.
Do you remember when you first read this story and what was something that stuck out with you?
For me, yeah. I was probably around 30-ish, a little later. And it was one of my adult, things that I encountered as an adult that really affected me. It was if earlier science fiction was sort of the nerd's triumph, or actually get some stature. And this was whoa, entrepreneurs are going to take over the world. And the government's just going to crumble, and whoever does something and has some initiative is going to create stuff and have some stature.
Mm-hmm.
So I better create companies and make things. This wasn't really an analysis of, is this a good world or a bad world? More of, okay, this is how you do stuff. This is where the power is now.
Do you think it was a good world or a bad world?
Overall, I don't like it as a direction.
It has kind of like Snow Crash. The world of Snow Crash has prefigured the Bay Area relatively well. Yeah, it's a world largely made by tech entrepreneurs. And what you've got is little enclaves of Redwood Shores. I mean, some of my best friends live in Redwood Shores.
It's nice over there.
I'm joking. I have no friends.
I have no friends who live in Redwood Shores.
Some of my best friends are nerds.
And there's a lot of just despair and filth as well. We have made many of the technologies that are in Snow Crash.
Second Life was it just came out part and parcel straight from that.
And Google Earth, right? We thought, I think, in general, that the problems, the technologies that are going to be regulated are the ones that fall into the playing God category. It's the genetic editing, it's the AI, it's making something. Yeah. Actually, It turns out that it looks like the technologies that are doing the most harm are targeted advertising, algorithmic editing of social media posts, right? This is the stuff that's this year putting the world on the precipice of potentially fairly bad things. I don't think anyone saw this is the dangerous thing. And it's kind of what happened in Snow Crash, right? This is the virus. The Snow Crash virus was a virus of language that would infect people and cause very bad outcomes. And it's almost a direct reflection of what's actually happening now with Facebook, with the problems in the world that are basically caused by language. And this is not CRISPR or AI. This is the boring stuff that's turned out to be the most harmful.
Yeah.
It's the knowledge of these things is enough to destroy us. Just the knowledge, just the toxic information. And I think we've just seen, 100 years now of that being amplified and made real. It's not the apple of the knowledge of good and evil. It's the algorithm of the knowledge of what you're going to click on.
But Joe, you work in biophysics. What about biological viruses?
The knowledge of a particular gene sequence of a virus that you could produce with a handy-dandy desktop protein sequencer or DNA synthesizer, which can putatively be created right now, and certainly will be ubiquitous in 15 years. That's a piece of knowledge that could be, that's like a global annihilation kind of knowledge. Like you have to not have that knowledge. Like that knowledge has to be suppressed somehow.
Is there a way?
I don't think so. Before that sort of, the first time people were meddling with real godlike properties, I think was Hiroshima, or when the nuclear bomb. And at first it was thought that, the knowledge of how to make that bomb is something that must never be, has to be protected. And then after a while, it kind of like flowed out, or people just kind of figured it out. And it's like, well, it turns out it's really hard to do that. But so that this notion hasn't really been fully tested yet. But now, it's like you could practically print it in fine print in the back of a business card or something, the sequence of some kind of virus that would have properties that would be 10 times worse than the 1918 flu virus. Then what?
And then what, indeed?
So I think Snow Crash was about a lot of mundane things, and one really important meta thing, which is this ability of ideas, of memes to seep into our actual brains and bodies and have a pretty profound effect. I think this is the thing that is easiest to overlook in the midst of all of the kind of sci-fi gadgetry that were invented in the book. But it's the one that has the biggest actual relevance to the world we're living in. So let's go out on a quote. And I think it's your turn, Brittney. What was your most influential quote from Snow Crash?
We are all susceptible to the pull of viral ideas, like mass hysteria, or a tune that gets into your head that you keep humming all day until you spread it to someone else. Jokes, urban legends, crackpot religions, Marxism. No matter how smart we get, there is always this deep irrational part that makes us potential hosts for self-replicating information.
This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode in the world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Dr. Christine Corbett Moran, Peter Eckersley, and Joe Betts-LaCroix, and Sophia Bruckner for joining us this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, the aforementioned Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plogue for his audio expertise, Ali Packard for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Brittney Gallagher and yours truly, hero protagonist, Phil Libin, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.